All right, so welcome everybody to our third session of the Adaptation Planning and Practices for Forest Carbon Management course. This is the third week where we talk about climate change vulnerabilities, climate change impacts, kind of understanding what these mean for our projects, and starting to do some thinking about kind of the vulnerability of our projects. So on behalf of all of the instructors, we are so glad that you are still here. You're sticking with us for the third week of the course. I just want to, well, so you've probably heard from one of us last week. You know, we've been checking in with everybody, kind of seeing how things are going for you, asking to set up a time to talk probably, you know, this week, or maybe you've checked in last week already, and kind of touch base. So, you know, it's not required, but we hope you take us up on it. And we would really appreciate to just kind of get to know you a little bit better. We did ask you to complete step 1 by today. You may not have finished. That's okay. We do check in on all the projects though. We go into the adaptation workbook and we see kind of where you're at and how far you've gotten. And we don't do this to be nosy, but we want to make sure that everybody's kind of keeping up with things. Folks aren't getting left behind. You know, if it seems like, you know, you're falling behind, you know, we'll definitely reach out. We're not, you know, gonna make you feel guilty or anything. We understand people have busy lives, busy weeks occasionally, and it's hard to squeeze this in. We just want to make sure that you're getting all the support that you need to be successful here. Okay, so you've heard us talk at length last week about getting kind of the right project size, getting into that Goldilocks zone where you're not too big or too small. As we check in with you all and we're reviewing your progress this week, particularly, we might reach out if it seems like we think you might have a complex project. We're not trying to be prescriptive here. We're not trying to, you know, direct you to take on less. You know, it's up to you to know how much, you know, time and capacity and ambition you have for your projects, but we are trying to be proactive here. We've learned a lot over the doing these courses over the last 6 years that complex projects can increase the risk of folks not completing the course. And so we just want to, you know, check in with folks if we think that, you know, you've got a lot of goals and objectives, just to kind of hear a little bit more about what you're thinking about for your project. And, you know, if you feel like that's the right size, that's great. You know, we put this figure up of being in the Goldilocks zone, but I realize that you probably don't really have a reference for what that zone is here, right? We put up some guidelines, 1 to 3 objectives or goals, 4 to 6 objectives. But we recognize that it's hard to really kind of figure this out. And this is really probably one of the most challenging aspects of the adaptation workbook process, is right off the bat, kind of getting things right. So we just want to remind everyone, you can go back, you can add more goals and objectives if you feel like you were on the too small side of things. If you bit off a little bit more and you're, you know, recognizing that those added goals and objectives really amount to a lot more work, you can go back and you can remove things as well. So it can be an iterative process. All right, so what we're going to do today, as I already mentioned, this is about understanding and evaluating climate change vulnerabilities. So we're going to just kind of kick off by doing just a little bit of a sort of meet the class, kind of virtually, just sort of see where projects are, get a sense of who's in the course and where. You've already talked to some folks in your discussion sessions already, but it's always nice to see it on a map. We're going to introduce step 2 of the adaptation workbook, the climate change impacts. We're going to talk a little bit about sort of where you can gather this information. How can you find where this information is in the adaptation workbook, in the syllabus? There's a lot of links to things. And so you just know where to look. Then we're going to talk about kind of going through what this looks like in the adaptation workbook website. And there's kind of 2 steps to this. Step 2 workbook. So it's kind of broken down into step 2.1 and 2.2. So we'll walk through that, and then we'll talk about what's your assignment for this week. All right, so here's a map that just kind of shows kind of a summary of where the projects are located. You can see we've got a strong representation in the Northeast, particularly in New England. So 2 in Maine, 3 in New Hampshire, 4 in Vermont, 3 in Massachusetts. That 3 off of the coast of Cape Cod is Massachusetts, and then 1 in Connecticut. So a lot there, and then almost split evenly between the Mid-Atlantic and in New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, between that, and in the Midwest in Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Arkansas. And then we've got a couple of folks out in the Western US, 1 in Colorado and 1 in Washington. So we kind of span east to west, which is pretty cool. But definitely have that emphasis in kind of the heart of our territory where we work in the Midwest and Northeast. So that seems like that feels good to me, to kind of have like a lot of projects where we really know what we're talking about, and then a couple that kind of stretch us a little bit, but that's fun. All right. So you're going to see this adaptation workbook 5-step process a lot through the course. I think I've already mentioned that. So last week we were really just kind of at the beginning, defining where we're working, what are our goals and objectives, what are our areas of interest. And so now that hopefully we've got a good handle on that, we move on now to step 2, which is all about assessing climate change impacts and vulnerabilities for our area of interest. And this really draws a lot on the published literature, published reports. It could be gray literature as well. There's a lot of resources out there. We've tried to do our best to compile them for you, but you may be aware of some that we're not aware of, or maybe your organization has produced some sort of internal reports. Everything and anything that seems applicable is fair game for this. And we're going to really be looking to those resources to inform what we think about here in the 2nd step of the workbook. So those key questions that we really want to tackle here is what are the characteristics of your project area that are going to interact with climate change impacts that you're seeing? And kind of then understanding, essentially how vulnerable is your project area to these impacts. So this is really, in my mind, this is kind of a process of filtering down. So we want to, recognize that these climate change impacts are really being felt everywhere throughout the region. And, all regions are going to be warming. All regions are going to be experiencing some shifts in precipitation. All regions are going to be having some kind of change in, the habitat suitability of some of the dominant species. Well, what we want to really do here in the 2nd step is we want to think about sort of your site characteristics and think about what are the most important of those impacts for your particular site, for your particular ecosystem, for your species that are there, for your components of your project area that are critical to your goals and objectives. So, that might be like, insect pests and diseases. You may have some tree species like hemlock that's really important, has a large component of the forest. And that's a particular impact that it's being felt everywhere, but because you have a lot of hemlock, that might be really rise to the top as being one of the more important ones. Okay, so we're going to kind of walk through, as I mentioned, we're going to walk through what this looks like, the process, in a few minutes. But before we get to kind of going through that, the two components of the step 2, we're going to talk a little bit about where is the information, where can you find it on the Adaptation Workbook website, and on the syllabus, so that you can really start to dig into understanding this, because I recognize some of this information might be very new to some of you. Others, you may have thought a bit about it. You may have read a lot about climate change and climate change impacts. So we're going to kind of go through a bunch of resources, and this is sort of the short list, the ones that I think kind of rise to the top. As I mentioned before, anything is fair game though. So on the right-hand side, you can see this potential climate impacts regional. This is sort of what you'll see in the adaptation workbook when you start on step 2. And so based on where you drop your pin for your particular project, it preloads these regional impacts. So these are specific to kind of your region, but they're very broad. So, if you've got a project in Maine, you'll be getting regional impacts that are specific to all of the New England region, right? And if you click on that eye icon, which is where that tan arrow is, then you can kind of read more about the particulars of that climate change impact. And so it'll pull up a report or a resource, and there'll be a link to it. There'll likely be some other citations. There might be a whole bunch of things that you can look to. It might be the vulnerability assessment that NIACS produced for that ecoregion. It might be the National Climate Assessment's Climate Science Special Report that came out in 2018. It could be any number of resources. That map on the left just kind of shows you in green where we at NIACS have done ecosystem vulnerability assessments for. So if you are in those regions or very near to them, those are going to be really good resources for you, and your impact statements will be kind of pulled from that if you're within that zone. Other areas shown in blue, we pulled impact statements from things like the National Climate Assessment summaries for states. And so you can see all of the United States is going to be covered by one of those two, if not both of those two things. On the bottom, we've got a link to the Impacts Explorer. You can't get to this when you're in your project, but if you remember that URL, adaptationworkbook.org explore-impacts, that will get you to this map where you can then click on a region and regional impacts will come up. So it's another way to kind of get at the same information that you'll be seeing in your project. And just to kind of hone in there, these are the regions where we've done the vulnerability assessment. So we have New England, Mid-Atlantic, Central Appalachians, the Northwoods region, and the Central Hardwoods region. And then we do have a number of urban assessments as well that I'll talk a little bit about in a few minutes here. Okay, and so you will, depending upon sort of what your focus is on your project, you could have some impact statements that relate to, individual forest types. So, if you clicked on northern hardwoods, you'll have some impact statements that are particular to northern hardwoods. And, for some of the other menus, like in the non-forested wetlands and grasslands menus, have impacts that are only specific to the Midwest region where the information kind of was developed to support those menus. So I mentioned if you are outside of one of our vulnerability assessment areas, you can find information from the National Climate Assessment. There's a whole bunch of other resources out there as well, and we tried to compile these as best that we could, but new things are always coming out. So, we can't guarantee that we're the most up to date on everything, but we've got a lot of the major ones that have come out recently. So, if you, for example, click in the Pacific Northwest, there's a number of products and GTRs that were produced from adaptation partners that talk about vulnerability to different ecoregions or more specific areas in the Pacific Northwest, for example. And so we have links to all of those. You can find those in the Adaptation Workbook Impacts Explorer, but we have also put those into the syllabus as well. And so we've tried to do our best to really make these easy for you to compile them as best we can. And this just kind of shows you kind of what that would look like. They link out to our forestadaptation.org website. So we've got a lot of these resources for other regions, as well as all of our vulnerability assessments in our climate change response framework website, which is, as I said, forestadaptation.org. I mentioned urban forests. I know there are a number of, at least a couple of people here who are working in more urban environments. And so, we recognize that urban systems are pretty different. And some of the considerations in urban forests are fairly unique to kind of more natural and working forested landscapes. There are a number of non-native tree species that might be a significant part of the urban tree canopy, cultivars, those sorts of things. And so we have, NIAX has worked on a number of urban vulnerability assessments across different areas in throughout the US. Sort of our first and probably shining example of that is the one you're seeing here on the left, the Chicago Wilderness Region Urban Vulnerability Assessment. All of this work was led by our colleague, Leslie Brandt. And she's done this in a number of other areas. So we do have one group that's working in the Chicagoland area. We have another group, I think that's kind of working or thinking about things in the Philadelphia area, and another group in the Milwaukee area. So fortunately, we have information on all of these urban areas. They kind of differ in terms of what they look like. They're not going to be probably as well as extensive, I guess, as the Chicago vulnerability assessment in these other regions or other urban areas, but there's usually, some summary information on climate impacts and tree species lists talking about, habitat suitability projections for different tree species that include a lot of those non-native or cultivars. And so you can find that information again at our forest adaptation website. And if there's an area you're interested in and you can't seem to find it, there is, let me go to my laser pointer. Up here, there's this search function here. You can always just like type in a city to see what information is there. Because you might say like, oh, I'm interested in Boston and I'm not seeing anything for Boston. You can just type in Boston and you might be able to, it would pull up some of the work that pertains to the Boston area. Okay. So that's kind of the really quick version of looking at the resources that are available to you. Now let's kind of talk about step 2 and how we, the process of thinking about site level impacts and vulnerabilities. All right, so the first thing, it's useful to define what we mean by vulnerability. And so the vulnerability is the degree to which a system is susceptible to and unable to cope with adverse effects of climate change, which includes, both climate variability, climate extremes, disturbances, all of those. So kind of a grab bag of things that could be related to changing climate conditions. Now, we typically think about vulnerability as having 2 components. So the first component describes potential impacts to your site or to your system, and the other is the adaptive capacity of the system. And then when we put these 2 things together, that really kind of gives us a sense of what the vulnerability of the system is. So we'll talk about each one of these here in the next few slides. So first, the potential impacts. Now, potential impacts kind of have 2 really important considerations to them. The first is, what is the system being exposed to? So kind of what is the primary, change in the system? It might be intense storms or extreme rainfall or, warmer temperatures. But that doesn't really describe the full picture. Because then we also need to think about, well, how sensitive is the system to those changes? And putting those 2 questions together about impacts, what we're really asking is, are those potential impacts likely to disrupt your system? Or, as we'll see when we get into next week's step 3, do those changes support the system? So what's the impact on the system? Really a function of both the exposure and the sensitivity to it. So an example, you might have 2 sites. They're both exposed to potential intense rainfall, right? And for much of our region in the east, this is a big deal. This is something we're really seeing as intense rainfall events. Well, you might have an upland site and on a site on steep slopes. The sensitivity of those 2 sites are going to be different. A well-drained upland site may not be very sensitive to that intense rainfall event, whereas a site that has a lot of steep slopes might be very sensitive to it. Okay, so that's, I think, pretty straightforward. The next is adaptive capacity. I feel like this one might be a little more challenging to get a handle on. It may take a little bit more thought, might take a little bit more reading, I think, for some of us to really kind of wrap our brains around this idea of adaptive capacity or really applying it to our particular site. But adaptive capacity is essentially how well can the system cope with that potential impact. So in other words, you can kind of think of it as like, well, all right, how resilient is our system? I mean, assuming not jumping ahead to like adaptation and what we're doing to help improve the resilience of the system, just kind of given current conditions, current management, how is the system going to be able to cope with those changes? An example of this might be thinking about a floodplain site. Oftentimes floodplain sites have a lot of species diversity. And so kind of going back to that same high intensity precipitation events that we're seeing a lot of. We might say, well, this site might be really able to cope with this. It might have a high adaptive capacity because the species might be adapted to fluctuating water hydrology and water levels. It might be because of the diversity of the site is high enough that if some species succumb to flooding, that others will be there and to be able to maintain productivity on the site. So a couple of different ways you can kind of think about the adaptive capacity. So putting these two things together now is how we really think about vulnerability. And so, on that impact side of things, it's really any kind of impact. It's either those direct changes like temperature, precipitation, but I kind of think about, like, when you think about tree mortality, tree mortality could be from expanding ranges of insect pests. And those insect pests might be moving into your area where they weren't before because of warming winters, right? So you can kind of think of like these pathways of impact where it may not be the direct climate change that's causing the impact, but a number of other ecological changes that are happening in response to that primary climate driver. And then again, adaptive capacity, there's a lot of different factors. I think this is explained really well in the Forest Adaptation Resources, GTR. That's going to be, I think, a great place to really go and kind of explore and wrap your head around adaptive capacity. But there's a number of things here that could relate to having greater or lesser adaptive capacity at your particular site. All right, so let's look at an example of how we can kind of think about a vulnerability. So this is an example from the Notch View Reservation. This is in Western Massachusetts. I think it's the Trustees of Reservations property. It's a 3,100 acre property, and it's mainly kind of a northern hardwood red spruce forest type. And there's a number, big property. So there's some forested swamps, some beaver ponds, streams, a couple of old fields there. And the trustees were really interested in thinking about the recreation at this site. So, they wanted to maintain the site for cross-country skiing, and they also, of course, wanted to maintain for high-quality natural habitats for the area. And so when the managers went through the adaptation workbook process, here's kind of what they kind of pulled out as some of their components of thinking about vulnerability. Well, they recognized that temperature change was moderated by high elevation, and that so that kind of their site, because of the elevation on their site, they weren't as concerned about the impact of temperature change, but they were concerned about those extreme events, extreme rain, wind, ice storms, because of the location. And then they also recognized that their site seemed to be maybe higher vulnerable because of the red spruce, and red spruce being one of those species that has kind of thought of as being maybe a little bit more vulnerable for the area. For the adaptive capacity, they recognized there were a number of things that really were kind of challenges or really kind of negatively impacting the ability of the site to be resilient: invasive plant species, EAB, deer browse, those sorts of things. And so they kind of put this all together to think about vulnerability. And so they thought, well, for their spruce fir, they gave that a high vulnerability. And they figured that, well, they might lose a lot of their red spruce by 2100. For the northern hardwoods, they gave it kind of a moderately high vulnerability, mainly because they anticipated that there might be some regeneration issues given the habitat suitability projections for some of those species in their location. And then for the recreation, was given a moderate vulnerability. They recognized that warming winters, shorter winters would reduce the skiing, but on the flip side, there was longer season for other outdoor for other sports like hiking and biking. Okay. Whew. Take a breather here. Take a drink of my coffee. Trying to get through this so that we have plenty of time here for questions after I go through these slides. All right, so I'm going to walk through kind of what this looks like, what you're going to see in the adaptation workbook, and kind of some of the pointers on how to navigate this. So as I mentioned, step 2 is split up into kind of 2 parts. Part 1 is about that regional impacts. So it's about taking all of those regional impacts and kind of selecting or identifying the ones that you think are really pertinent to your site. So you'll see on this portion of your screen here, just to orient you to what we're looking at, these are all of your regional impacts. This middle section here, this is your step 2. So you'll have kind of your 2 management topics or what you've set up as your project, and of course this is kind of your table of contents. Kind of shows you where you are in the adaptation workbook process. So as you go through each of these climate impact statements, you'll see that there is this information icon. When you click on that information button, this is what you'll see. It'll bring up kind of the particulars of the climate change impact. So it'll give a couple of sentence description of the change, and then it'll give you the sources, and then it'll show you here this icon, this chain icon is the link to get to that resource. If you wanted to check it out, if you want to download it, you can get to the kind of the primary information here. You're able to add in kind of notes about why this particular impact is important to your project or to your location by clicking this this comment bubble right here. So it'll bring up this this window here, and so it'll allow you to kind of it'll say draw on your experience or your knowledge and describe that the attributes of your project area that may modify this general impact. So why is this important? Okay, so you can really kind of tie it to your site. Down here at the bottom, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom of your regional impacts, you can add a custom regional climate impact statement. So it'll just bring up this window. You can describe it. You can make comments about why it's important for your project. You can put in a link. You can put in a link to sort of the evidence, and you can always add more information. So these are really customizable. Anything that didn't come up in that pre-populated list that you're aware of or you read about, you think is important. I'm going to just back up here just to say here, anything that you don't think is particularly relevant. For example, sea level rise is probably going to come up for anyone whose region has a coastal region, but you could be 200 miles from the ocean, so sea level rise isn't going to matter. You can click on that X and that just removes that from your list. So anything that you just don't really think is particularly relevant or is a concern for you, just go ahead and remove it from the list. Okay, the second step or the second part, I should say, of step 2 is that vulnerability determination. And this is really, this is really kind of up to you to decide. And it's so we've got these kind of these slider bars here for the 2 parts. So there's the potential impacts here, and you can go either from very supportive, so this impact could be a positive thing, to very disruptive, with mixed or neutral in the middle. And then the adaptive capacity below it, which is either from low to high, low, moderate, or high. And there is that information icon here that you can click, and we'll give you some more information if you need a reminder of how to kind of think about this. So you're going to do these two sliders for each kind of forest type or topic area that you identify in your step 1 of your workbook. And so what you're going to see as a result of doing these 2 sliders is you're going to see this orange dot appear on this chart here, which is just basically kind of a 2 by, I shouldn't say 2 by 2, but it's adaptive capacity on one axis and impacts on the other. So, if you have high adaptive capacity and the impacts are supportive, you're going to be in this light gray area, which means you're probably, thinking that this is low vulnerability. Alternatively, if you're over here in this dark gray area where the impacts are really disruptive and you have a low adaptive capacity, that's going to result in a high vulnerability rating. All right, so this can probably feel pretty overwhelming, and folks might be worried that you have a hard time deciding on how to evaluate your system. What if I'm wrong? We want to emphasize, don't stress out about this. This isn't going to derail your workbook. This isn't going to take you onto a path where you can't access other resources, or it's really just for you to start to kind of weigh these different things, and there is no right or wrong answer. It's important to to think about it, to kind of give your best sort of guess as to what the vulnerability is, and really outline your ideas. What are the factors that come into play on this? Why do you think that it would be higher or lower vulnerability? That's all really useful information. So it's really about the process and not so much what the end result is. It can give you really that initial sense of whether or not you need to be concerned about a particular management topic or forest type, and kind of help you to think about sort of what are the things that are at greatest risk. And you can always, go back and change things. And I'll keep saying this over and over again to hopefully take the pressure off. You can always go back in the workbook and kind of toggle things or modify things. If you've had a conversation with a colleague and you say oh, actually, I didn't think about that. That's important, and I should change that. All right. So we recognize it's easy to jump ahead. It's really tempting to start thinking about, how all these dots start to connect up here, to think about, okay, these climate change effects are going to, impacts are going to affect sort of what might do in my management. It's easy to think about oh, how is this vulnerability going to play into thinking about how I might adapt to these impacts. But we want you to really try to stay focused on the information here in this step 2, and we're going to kind of discourage you from jumping ahead quite yet. So right now, just try to focus on those climate change impacts and how you think they're going to affect the components of your system. The ecosystem processes, the biological components, the infrastructure, all those necessary parts and pieces like the hydrology, the soils, the vegetation. Next week we'll jump ahead, and then we'll start exploring how this, is going to play out to create challenges and opportunities for your management. All right, so just I guess a couple of reminders here. You'll see that pre-populated list of impact statements that are specific to your geographic location. So just a reminder, these were filtered when you dropped that pin. So if you put a pin kind of in the wrong spot, you're going to get you're going to get different climate change impacts than if you had put the pin in the right area, just depending upon the boundaries of those vulnerability assessments. So again, remove any climate impact statements that don't really apply to your project. Get specific and describe how the climate impacts will affect your project area in the comments bubble. And then remember, you can always add or customize any impacts that you have as well. And then just the last thing about the vulnerability determinations, for when you select, like in that step one, you'll have like a bunch of forest ecosystem types that that occur within your geography. And so if you select some of those, like transition hardwoods or something like that, the vulnerability the determinations are going to come up sort of preloaded. And that's because, if you're working in an area where we have completed a vulnerability assessment, we've got sort of generalized vulnerability determinations for forest types. So don't take that as gospel truth. Again, this is about your site and the site characteristics. And so you're going to use that as a starting point, but you will likely change things depending upon what your site looks like, unless your site's just a totally average site, and then maybe that predetermined vulnerability determination will work for you. Let's see. Don't forget the Adaptation Workbook tutorials are in there. They have those, we have those kind of pull down screens that you can minimize. Watch those recorded tutorials. They're really helpful. They're good reminders just at how to complete the step. What are the important things to be thinking about as well. All right, that was a whirlwind of step 2. And so this is, you'll find this in your syllabus, in addition to a lot of those resources that I talked about. But what we're asking you to do this week is to spend some time going through those climate change impacts and vulnerability resources for your region or for your state. Again, we've reached out to you. Get in contact with us if you need more help, if you're interested in finding additional resources, or you have ideas for resources that you don't see on our website. That would be wonderful. We'd love to make sure that we're adding to the resources that we have. And then, of course, complete step 2 of the workbook. And as you can see, I think there's a lot of thought that needs to go into this, especially if you're not particularly comfortable with the kind of the climate change impacts and ecosystem vulnerabilities, if that's something that you're kind of new to. Of course, every week we've just got the quick homework section after completing the step 2 in the workbook. So make sure you answer those questions. We do really like to see what folks say in those. That's helpful for us. And then this is just a reminder in your syllabus, there is an optional lecture on Wednesday at the normal discussion time on Wednesday at 11 o'clock Eastern. And so we kind of talked really broadly about impacts and vulnerability, just in terms of how you do it in the workbook. There are videos, and all those resources that get into what the impacts are for your particular region, but they're very general. They're ecosystem impacts, and you're all here because carbon is of interest to you for some reason or another. And so those ecosystem impacts don't really get into like, well, what does this mean for carbon? So I'm going to provide an optional lecture like this one. It will be recorded and it will be uploaded to the YouTube channel for NIACS. But we'll kind of talk a little bit about some of these climate change impacts and what they mean for carbon stocks and for carbon sequestration. We can't, of course, cover all the regions, so it's going to be sort of generalized, but at least it'll be sort of focused on carbon impacts. And that the same link that you use to get to this lecture will be the one to get to that optional lecture on Wednesday at 11. All right, and so lastly, looking ahead, next week, as I've already alluded to, is going to be the introduction to the third step of the workbook, is where we get into kind of evaluating our management objectives, given these projected impacts and vulnerabilities that we're thinking about this week. And just a reminder of that optional session this week as well. And again, definitely reach out to us and schedule a time to check in with us. We'd love to just hear more and get to know you a little bit more. So that's all I have. And yeah, Danielle, if you want to stop the recording, and then we'll